My name is Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. We are going to be talking today about a poem from Su Dongpo, one of my favorite Chinese poets. We are also going to talk about the history behind that poem. How did this poem become so important? Why was Su Dongpo put on trial partially for this poem? Why was this poem introduced as evidence in Su Dongpo's trial? Okay, before we get to the actual poem itself, let's jump into that history. First, just as a side note, Su Dongpo's given name is not Su Dongpo, it's Su Shi. Dongpo is kind of his rap name, his artistic name. He gave it to himself later in life. I prefer Su Dongpo. I think it's cooler. I also think it's a little bit more common, a term to talk about him. But afterwards, if y'all go searching for more information on Su Dongpo and you start to see people talking about Su Shi, just know that is what's going on. Let's set up the context of the poem. The Song Dynasty, China's greatest dynasty, collapses in the early 900s. The most glorious period of Chinese history and Chinese literature comes to an end. During this period, China is racked by insecurity. Eventually, small states develop in the south of China. In the north of what is today modern China, you have two very large non-Chinese states developing in the area, in the territory that was once part of Tang China. So the area around Beijing and Manchuria, you have a non-Chinese state develop up there. First, you have the Khitans, an ethnic group that set up a state called the Liao Dynasty, which conquered much of the territory in northern China and Mongolia. Then you have the Jurchens and the Tanguts who take over that same band of North China with two separate states. One is the Western Sha, that's the one run by the Tanguts, and then you have the Qin Dynasty. The Qin is run by the Jurchen, their ancestors to today's Manchurian people. They ran the Qin Dynasty, largely covering the state that had once been run by the Khitans, the Liao Dynasty. In between the north and the south, in what once was the heartland of Chinese empires, you had chaos. You had Chinese and non-Chinese people taking over these small statelets, claiming to represent the true empire, just in the state that would eventually become what we today call the Song. Power changed hands 3 or 4 times in the period about 10 to 15 years before the Song established itself. One general, he's non-Chinese, he takes over, he says it's a new dynasty, they're going to command everything and take over the country, yada, yada, yada. But then that dynasty founder will die and leave his empire to his young son, who is not capable. The son will be overthrown, and another general will take over. That's actually how the Song got started. The Song was a very small state in central China. The son of the previous dynasty founder took over, but he didn't have the vigor to run it. So one of the generals of the state, Zhao Kuangying, he pushed the boy emperor aside and said, "Nah, I got this. I'm in charge." That is the inauspicious beginning of the Song Dynasty, right there in 960. Today, looking back, it's hard to imagine it, but no one thought that the Song Dynasty would last that long. It became one of the most important dynasties in the history of China, and the dynasty would, in some form, last from 960 to 1279 AD. For about a century, the Song was kicking butts and taking names. Zhao Kuangying, dynasty founder, expanded the state from just a single small state in central China to taking over most of central and southern China. But the north, that was a problem. The north was still dominated by these non-Chinese states, run by first the Khitan and then the Jurchens, and then the other one run by the Tanguts. This is something that several Song dynasty emperors went to war to try and change. The Song was never able to conquer these barbarian states to the north, and eventually the Song would be swallowed up by one of those northern barbarian groups. What did the Song dynasty want to accomplish with their wars against the northern barbarians? They wanted to take control of this territory, which they considered it Chinese. What did the Song Dynasty actually accomplish with their wars against the northern barbarians? A lot of money was wasted. By 1065, Song China was spending 83% of government money on its military. It had essentially created a war economy. And in the political scene, you had two groups develop, the conservatives and the liberals. The term conservative is a term that most scholars today would use to describe the group around Su Dongpo. The conservatives thought that the solution to the government's debt problem was to spend less and stop fighting the barbarians. The Song Dynasty liberals thought that the way to deal with the economic problem was not to cut back on spending, as the conservatives thought. Rather, they thought that they could spend their way out of the problem, led by one of the most controversial figures in Chinese history, and a poet in his own right. Rob and I did 2 podcasts on Wang Anshi's poems in June and July of 2021. Wang Anshi led the liberals. He believed that the government could spend more money and become more efficient and thus solve China's economic problems. I want to emphasize the terms liberal and conservative, although I like using them because I see them as connected to their modern usages somewhat, and I like being able to make Song Dynasty economics relevant to modern listeners. I don't want you to take this podcast as making a statement about contemporary liberals or contemporary conservatives. I'm just using this label because I think it's helpful. If you don't have a label for something, then I find it's oftentimes hard for modern listeners, modern readers, to think through things in a successful way. It's just kind of a jumble of Chinese names, and they don't ever comprehend what's going on. By using these labels, my hope is not to make a comment on contemporary politics. My hope is that it will give you a framework so that you can kind of start to relate Song Dynasty politics, Song Dynasty economics to your own thinking about the subject. Okay, back to the main thing. Wang Anshi enacts these controversial policies. They're known as the Xinjiang, literally new policies. Wang Anshi takes power in 1069. He starts enacting these policies in 1069, 1070. What are the new policies? The new policies involved the government very deeply in the economy to a depth that few Chinese governments had ever been involved in the economy. Before, poor farmers throughout the Song Dynasty were like sharecroppers. In fact, it's probably just better to say they were sharecroppers. They would get loans for next year's seed, loans to tide them over during the winter when they weren't producing food. That would pay for next year's seeds, but also clothing and food to feed their family. These loans would generally come from local wealthy folks, and the charge that the liberals made is that these local wealthy folks were making too much money off their loans to the poor. And indeed, many poor farmers were at the time driven into a cycle of debt by these loans. It was not a good situation. So what is Wang Anshi's solution to this problem? He comes up with a program called the Green Sprouts Program, literally 青苗法. The Green Sprouts Program was meant to allow the government to extend loans to farmers and thus bypass local rich folk. Wang Anshi's logic was this. The government can hand out these loans at cost. He planned on not charging interest on these loans in the Green Sprouts Program. That way, poor farmers could get the loans that they needed without becoming impoverished. He was trying to break this debt cycle that I talked about earlier. Conservatives like Su Dongpo and Sima Guang did not believe him. They didn't believe that the government wasn't ever going to charge interest on these loans. Su Dongpo, commenting on Wang Anshi's claim that the government would not charge interest on these loans, said, when a man shows up to the woods, he's got hunting dogs and a hunting falcon, and he says, I ain't here to hunt. Are you really going to believe him? And in fact, Su Dongpo was correct. Even though it appears Wang Anshi was genuine when he stated that the government did not initially want to charge interest on these loans. What happened is Wang Anshi hit a government reality. Emperor Shenzong, he's the emperor who has put Wang Anshi into the highest position in government, wants to use that money generated by these loans to fight his wars against the northern barbarian Tanguts that we mentioned earlier in the podcast. So Wang Anshi says, we ain't going to charge for these loans. Emperor Shenzong says, I want to make money off these loans. Guess who won? That's right, it's the emperor. Somewhere in the policy-making process, and I'm still not entirely clear on exactly how this happened, but it did happen. Wang Anshi's goal of making these loans at cost rather than with interest, that was dropped. In the end, the government loans had interest on them. They cost the farmers money. But like I said, the conservatives had all along expected that to happen. They had not believed that Wang Anshi would really not charge interest on these loans, though looking back at the sources, it does look like Wang Anshi initially thought that that would work out just fine. The Green Sprouts program got started, and according to the records that we have today, things went pretty badly. And this is the point where we have today's poem by Su Dongpo, one of those conservative critics of Wang Anshi. Here's the poem. Carrying the government money on walking sticks within rice wraps, they hurry away. In the flash of an eye, that cash is gone from their hands. The only thing they got out of these reforms was that their kids speak with pretty accents, since they spent the better part of half of the year living in the city. That's my translation. I'm going to post that translation and the original poem on the website, ChineseLiteraturePodcast.com. Check it out. Let's break down that poem. Carrying the government money on walking sticks and within rice wraps, they hurry away. In the flash of an eye, that cash is gone from their hands. Here we have this image of these country bumpkins. They're getting so much money that they don't know what to do with it. They don't even know how to carry it. They're having to hang it off the walking sticks and wrap it up in rice wraps. This is a very evocative image. In China, even today, or at least when I was last in China, you could still see people carrying stuff on these sticks that were carried across their necks on their shoulders. It's crazy to imagine people having been given so much money through these means that they have to carry them in this way. And it points to the fact that, at least from Su Dongpo's perspective, that money is far too much for them to actually know how to deal with that. I don't want to get too deep into contemporary politics, but I want to look with skepticism at Su Dongpo and his claim here that the poor get so much money that they don't know what to do with it. There's an article in The Economist in December 7th, 2023, so just a few days before I'm recording this, called Giving the Poor a Wad of Cash is Better Than Dripping It Out. And it shows some economic arguments for being skeptical of Su Dongpo's claim that the poor, when given money, don't know what to do with it. They go and waste it all. That's Su Dongpo's argument. I just want to give the opposing argument and make sure that that's out there. Okay. Back to the poem. Su Dongpo has this image of country bumpkins who don't know what to do with all the cash that they are given. Sure enough, in Su Dongpo's poem, they lose most of the government handouts from the Green Sprouts program almost immediately. The commentaries in explaining what happened to this money, this isn't me saying it, this is coming from the commentaries. They say that essentially government officials are the ones who decided this money, it's going to get released on this particular day to the farmers. They would go and they would conspire with other government officials and they would set up big celebrations right next to the government offices. They would have government-run liquor stores with lots of gambling and lots of prostitution. And they would hold these celebrations right after they had given out a tranche of the Green Sprouts money. So you have these bumpkins, and I don't mean to be mean to farmers, but you have to look at it from the perspective of a Song Dynasty farmer in the 1070s. They live in these tiny villages where very little happens. Their days are devoted to back-breaking labor. All of a sudden, you have this government program that's calling on them to go into the cities, and they are stunned by the amount of modern stimulation on offer. Girls, booze, gambling. This is Las Vegas for them. This is a whole new world. Try and imagine some rube from a middle-of-nowhere farm in one of those flat states in the United States coming to Vegas And you get this sense of the overstimulation that Su Dongpo is arguing is happening. What is the result of all this? Let's look at lines 3 and 4. The only thing they got out of these reforms was that their kids speak with pretty accents, since they spent the better half of the year living in the city. The only positive results that these farmers get from spending all this time in the city is that their sons speak more like city slickers. They end up speaking more like city folk. That is it. That is the result of all of this government money being spent. Now, this poem might seem to you and me like it's not really that big of a deal. But in the hothouse that was partisan politics during the Song Dynasty, when bickering between the liberals and conservative was so intense and everyone read deep into anything that anyone wrote, no one was confused about what Su Dongpo was saying in this poem. Everyone understood this as damning Wang Anshi and the other liberals. What did the liberals do? They went after Su Dongpo hard. Wang Anshi was pushed out of power in 1074, and he and Su Dongpo actually ended up becoming friends. But the liberals who replaced Wang Anshi attacked Su Dongpo hard. They searched Su Dongpo's papers trying to find incriminating evidence against him. They actually went and searched Su Dongpo's family's boat. And the women in his family complained that Su Dongpo's writings had never done anything other than get them in trouble. After the soldiers searching the boat left, they burned many of Su Dongpo's papers just because they were like, we don't want the hassle of dealing with these literary investigations. In 1079, the liberals were able to put Su Dongpo on trial for his poems. This poem, the one that we just read today about carrying the money with the sticks and the farmers' sons getting pretty accents and nothing else, this poem was one of those cited during the trial. Su Dongpo was tried and investigated. This lasted several months. In July, Rob and I did a podcast on a poem on the salt monopoly that Su Dongpo wrote. This was another one of the poems that was involved in the trial. In the trial, Su Dongpo was accused of publishing poems that slandered the new policies, which, of course, that's exactly what he did. At the end of that year, Su Dongpo was convicted, demoted, and banished. This time to Huangzhou, not Hangzhou, Huangzhou, an even more rural backwater. Su Dongpo was exonerated some. The trial concluded that Su Dongpo had not intended to slander the emperor, which was a good thing. For the rest of Su Dongpo's life, he's going to go back and forth. Liberals will take power and accuse Su Dongpo of disloyalty. Each time he's banished to more and more of a rural backwater. He's eventually going to end up in Hainan, which today is a nice beach island in southern China. It's where the rich and famous in China go for their beach vacation. But back then it was a malaria-infested island that only officials who did really bad things were sent off to. When the conservatives took power, Su Dongpo would slowly be allowed more freedom. But once the liberals took power, the cycle would begin again. This is where I'm going to end this podcast. Honestly, I don't want to end it. This story of Su Dongpo's 1079 trial is so fascinating. He's going back and forth between the center to the periphery. As he's doing this, he's writing some of the greatest poetry in Chinese history. Rob and I did a podcast on his exile. We released it almost a year ago from the day I'm recording this, December 10th, 2022. If you want, take a listen to that episode as well. I'm going to end it here. Our Chengyu for this episode comes, no surprise, from Su Dongpo. It's 夜雨对船, literally something like to face beds on a rainy night. The story behind this Chengyu is that Su Dongpo had read a Tang Dynasty poem, and there was a line in it, I am willing to know windy, snowy nights in order again to sleep in a bed facing yours. After he read this Tang Dynasty poem, he met his brother, and they had been separated for a long time. He meets his brother, and they have a long heart-to-heart conversation in beds that were facing each other. So this phrase, 夜雨对船, it comes to mean having a heart-to-heart conversation after a long separation. Well, that's it for me. If you liked this episode, or if you hated it, send me an email. I love hearing from you, even if it takes me a long time to respond. I love reading what you think of the podcast, good or bad. If you like this podcast, consider supporting me on Patreon. I guess you can support me If you hated this podcast, though, I don't know if that would make sense, but please feel free to do it if you want. I promise you, I will not waste your money on prostitution or gambling. Instead, I will invest it in alcohol, as Su Dongpo would encourage me to do. Also, check out the webpage, ChineseLiteraturePodcast.com. I'll put the translation in the original up. I'm also going to put that Economist article up, the one arguing against Su Dongpo. And I find it interesting that we're still having this discussion 1,000 years later. Okay, that's it for me. I'm Lee Moore. This is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Until next time, 再见.